Night fell like a curtain of wet steel over the island, every palm and jagged coral ridge swallowed by a darkness that smelled of salt and diesel. The Japanese thought they had the Americans boxed in. Bodies pressed into shallow foxholes, radios whispering thin signals, machine gun nests glittering like teeth in the half-light, confident that their cordon would choke off escape and crush any hope of relief. But the real story began not with the enemy's certainty, but with the long, cold patience of Marines who had been trained to wait until fear turned to complacency. And so the camera closes in on the taut faces, the hands white on rifle stocks, the breath fogging in the humid air as men whisper prayers and last names into the dark. While beyond their perimeter, the Japanese officers, secure in their plan, counted bodies and rationed bullets as if victory were already a done deal, unaware that the island itself was preparing to betray their confidence, that the night was a lie wrapped in stillness, and that every silent reef and shadowed coconut grove would soon become a stage for an unthinkable reversal. And the first minute of this tale must basket the viewer in suspense. Imagine the slow, deliberate patting of boot soles across sand, the gleam of a bayonet catching starlight, a single flare snapped and then snuffed, and then a loaded breath, the taut pause before a scream. This is the moment the film lures the audience into the trap of expectation before ripping it apart, because horror and triumph both thrive on surprise. And what follows is that raw, wrenching surprise writ large, an operation of stealth and savagery so precise that it transforms what had been a hopeless encirclement into an annihilating night of retribution. And we tell it not with dry dispatches, but with the sweat and grit of men who crossed the threshold between survival and legend, men who would seize a single night and make history of it. The Marines who would deliver this blow were not glamorous heroes in polished uniforms. They were young, teeth-gnashing, salt-stiffened fighters who had learned to read the night like a book and whose commanders had spent years carving doctrine out of blood and trial. They understood the mechanics of surprise, timing, noise discipline, the cruel geometry of concentric lines. And where the Japanese believed their encirclement absolute, the Americans had mapped the gaps in silence and shadow where an attacker could slip like a hand into a pocket, where sentries leaned too far, where patrols overlapped and thought themselves safe. And so the assault was planned with a surgeon's patience, everything rehearsed until the men could move without thinking, until the skin itself memorized the cadence of the attack. And then when the hour arrived, they moved as one breath. The first assault parties slithered out of concealment like ghosts, each step measured, each muzzle muffled with rag and tape, the dull clack of boots swallowed by ocean breeze, while forward observers timed the moon, calculated gull patterns, and waited for the precise second when light and shadow conspired. And in that sliver of time the Marines struck, silently at first, like knives finding flesh, taking out watch positions, severing phone lines, and plunging bayonets into throats before the startled enemy could shape thought into shout. The Japanese, trained for conventional warfare and confident in their numbers, were not prepared for this intimacy of violence, and panic spread like a contagion, rupturing command and seeding chaos, while mortars and prepositioned demolition teams, triggered by the hush of movement and the coded flashes of signal, turned strategic points into hellish bonfires, the night blooming with flame, smoke, and the metallic taste of fear. As the hours peeled away, small pockets of resistance were methodically crushed. Sections of enemy who had believed themselves secure were isolated, surrounded and executed with brutal efficiency. The tally of the night growing into the impossible, thousands cut down before dawn, and the sense of inevitability the Japanese had felt at twilight reversed into a nightmare of retreat and slaughter. Throughout, the narration keeps one pulse under the tension, personal perspective, the grunt who remembers the smell of enemy uniforms soaked with rain, the lieutenant who counts bodies with shaking fingers, the medic who moves blindly through the blood and thinks only to keep faces alive. Human detail stitches the scale to something the viewer can feel in teeth and gut. So the massacre is not an abstract statistic, but a litany of names and small moments, each casualty a bell tolling for someone's son. And yet the execution of the operation is cold and precise, Because victory in a single night requires a clinical mind as much as a savage heart. We never sentimentalize the slaughter. Instead, we present it as the brutal arithmetic of war. Preparation multiplied by courage, deception multiplied by surprise, and we do so through layered sensory detail. The wet slap of waves on coral, the scream cut short by a crushed throat, the contemptuous echo of Japanese commands turned into muffled pleas, the frantic rustle of maps seized and torn, the clang of a boot against a shattered radio, and above it all the measured voice of command, delivering orders that were at once humane and unforgiving. Because mercy on a battlefield can invite catastrophe, and Allen-like audacity, though this story is Marine, not Allen, demands a calculus where mercy is a variable that breaks the equation. The film's first minute must anchor that duality, the shock of the kill and the cold mind that delivered it, the survival instinct of men who did what they had to do, and the quiet horror of commanders who later counted and realized that 200 men had died in a single night. An apocalyptic ledger that would change operational doctrine and haunt both sides for years. By dawn, the island was hush and ruin. Japanese ranks lay broken in lines and clusters, their positions neutralized, their radio exchanges gone silent. And where once there had been the confident order of an occupying force, there now lay a landscape of stunned survivors and smoking wreckage. And in the aftermath, the Americans, bloodied and exhausted, gathered the wounded, counted the dead, and realized the strategic magnitude of what they had accomplished and of what they had unleashed. Because a victory on that scale did not merely remove an enemy presence, it sent a shockwave through command centers, altered calculations of vulnerability, and rewired the psychology of the Pacific War, teaching both sides an unforgiving lesson about the lethal fruit of underestimating an opponent's will and the monstrous efficiency of a night assault executed without hesitation. The segment ends with a suspended beat, an image of a single, lone Marine standing on a ridge at first light, rifles slung, silhouetted against a blood-red horizon, while the narrator's voice, low, almost ashamed of its own exhilaration, says the simple truth that hooks the viewer for all that follows. In one night, the wrong kind of confidence became a canyon into which 3,200 men fell, and history would never look at encirclement the same way again. By the second hour of that night, the lines between hunter and hunted had dissolved completely. The Japanese, who had once stalked through the jungled ridges with arrogant precision, now found themselves hemmed in by ghosts that struck and vanished before a heartbeat could count 3. The Americans, pressed against the earth for days, suddenly moved with purpose born of hunger and vengeance. The radio crackle that once carried orders to hold position now spat nothing but static and panic. Voices screamed in overlapping bursts, coordinates lost in chaos, commanders shouting into voids that no longer answered. Every flare that rose into the black canopy was answered by silence, a silence more terrifying than gunfire, because it meant the enemy was already too close. The Marines had mastered that silence. They used it as a weapon. They knew the Japanese had studied their tactics, predictable patterns of movement, reliance on heavy support fire, cautious advance, so that night they abandoned predictability altogether. No artillery prelude, no warning bursts, just a creeping, suffocating momentum, a tide of movement so slow and deliberate that even the insects seemed to pause. When they finally opened fire, it wasn't with scattered shots, but with a single synchronized roar, the air ripping apart under the sound of rifles and bars in perfect unison. Men on both sides froze in disbelief. How could a force surrounded hours ago suddenly sound like an army advancing? That was the illusion. Small units spaced across ravines, firing in patterns that mimicked a much larger force. The Japanese front wavered, then broke. One officer, panicked, ordered a retreat uphill, straight into machine gun crossfire. Another, believing the Marines were few, called for a bayonet charge, but the darkness turned every direction into death. Bullets snapped through palms, grenades hissed into pits, and the humid night filled with the smell of cordite and burning grass. And through it all, the Marines kept their discipline. Not a cheer, not a cry. Just the calm breathing of men who knew exactly what they were doing. Then came the counterassault. Desperate, feral, hundreds of Japanese soldiers charging through their own dead to reach a phantom enemy. The ground shook with the impact. Bayonets clashed in blind fury. Men fought at distances too small for rifles, turning entrenching tools, knives, and bare hands into instruments of annihilation. It was war stripped of all theory, reduced to the savage heartbeat of survival. But the Marines had trained for chaos. Their sergeants, veterans of Guadalcanal and Tarawa, shouted directions that cut through the madness. "Hold your line. Push left, don't waste a bullet." These commands became lifelines. Fire teams pivoted with machine precision, dragging wounded men to cover, rotating barrels before they overheated, counting rounds in whispers. And when ammunition ran low, they took from the dead, a friend or foe, it didn't matter. By 3 a.m., the Japanese formations had collapsed into fragments. Commanders dead or missing, their units fought in pockets of confusion, while American flares painted the jungle in stuttering flashes of red and white, revealing scenes that defied belief. Men locked in motionless struggle, bayonets frozen mid-thrust, eyes wide open under drifting smoke. The field became a nightmare mosaic of the living and the dead, indistinguishable in the flickering light. Yet even as the slaughter deepened, there was method in the madness. The Marine radios, once whispers, now carried concise updates. Sector C cleared. Ammo low. Proceeding south. Each report moved up the chain to a captain who stood knee-deep in blood and debris, his voice steady as he relayed coordinates for mortar teams. The bombardment that followed was surgical. Explosions marched across the ridge like footsteps, cutting off escape routes, collapsing trenches, sealing the enemy's fate. At dawn, the scale of the destruction revealed itself. Smoke drifted in heavy curtains over the valley. The ground steamed with dew and blood. Over 3,000 Japanese soldiers lay where they had stood hours before, their weapons still clutched, their faces turned upward as if in disbelief. The Marines, fewer than 1,000 of them, moved among the wreckage in stunned silence. Some laughed softly, the sound brittle and hollow. Others just stared, unable to comprehend what they had done. One private, his hands trembling, wrote a single line in his field notebook. "We weren't supposed to win this." And perhaps they weren't. Every doctrine, every number, every prediction had said the same thing. They were surrounded, outnumbered, doomed. But doctrine doesn't account for will, and will was the only weapon they had left. That night proved that a cornered man can become something unstoppable, something that even the most disciplined army cannot contain. The Japanese had underestimated the human instinct to fight not for victory, but for survival. And the Marines, in turn, had learned that discipline is the skeleton that holds courage upright when reason collapses. The camera of our story lingers now, drawing the viewer deeper, not to glorify the carnage, but to feel the cost of it. We see a medic washing blood from his hands, his face blank. A squad leader collecting dog tags in a tin. A sergeant lighting a cigarette over the body of his fallen friend because that's the only ritual he can still perform. The narration slows, almost whispers. They came to this island as soldiers. They left it as ghosts. It's not sentiment. It's truth. The kind of truth that grips the viewer's throat and won't let go. And just when it seems the story has reached its end, when the audience feels they've seen the worst, we plant the hook for what comes next. The radio operator, hands shaking, tuning into a new signal. Through the static comes a Japanese voice, calm, deliberate, chilling. Reinforcements inbound. The Marines look at each other, exhausted, blood-soaked, half-mad, and realize the night's horror was only the beginning. The music swells, the scene cuts to black, and the voiceover closes the first chapter with the sentence that ensures no one dares click away. They thought the nightmare was over, but the island had other plans. As the sun began to rise over the shattered coastline, the battlefield shifted from a realm of shadows and confusion to one of grim clarity. The pale light revealed what the darkness had hidden. An island transformed by combat. Every ridge and crater now part of a living map of struggle. Yet in that faint glow, one truth stood clear. The Marines were still standing. The enemy's confidence had dissolved into disbelief. What had been intended as a clean encirclement had become a disaster of their own making. But even in victory, The Marines knew the danger wasn't gone. The jungle was thick, the terrain unforgiving, and the Japanese were known to regroup faster than anyone expected. The men checked their weapons, replaced empty magazines, and looked toward the tree line, where the soft hum of insects masked what might have been footsteps. They had fought through the night without sleep, running on instinct and adrenaline, but the possibility of another attack kept them alert, every muscle tuned to the faintest sound. Their officers moved among them quietly, issuing orders in low tones. Reposition here, fortify that line, set up new perimeters. It was not celebration, but preparation, the understanding that survival depended on readiness. In the command tent, maps were spread across makeshift tables, edges held down by empty ammo boxes. The commanding officer, his uniform torn and smudged, leaned over the charts with a grim expression. "We hold," he said simply. Around him, radio operators adjusted dials, relaying messages in clipped voices. The scale of the previous night's battle was only beginning to register. Units that had been declared lost were suddenly reporting back, their numbers small but alive. Reinforcements were being signaled from offshore vessels, and medics were coordinating evacuation for the wounded. The system was battered, but it still functioned. That discipline, that quiet, methodical order, was what separated chaos from collapse. The Marines had learned that lesson through every campaign in the Pacific. When the situation feels hopeless, organization is salvation out on the ridgeline. Scouts were already advancing into the haze, marking positions, clearing debris, and listening for signs of regrouping. The smell of salt and smoke mixed in the air, and somewhere inland, a hidden battery fired a single shell, its explosion echoing like a warning. The Marines responded instantly, adjusting formation and returning controlled bursts toward the source. There was no panic, no wasted motion. Each man had a role, and every movement was deliberate. It was a symphony of survival conducted under pressure. And as the narrator's voice would remind the audience, this was the essence of the Pacific Campaign. Not just courage, but coordination. Not just bravery, but balance between aggression and restraint. Hours passed, and the heat grew oppressive. The men drank from canteens that tasted of rust and grit, their faces streaked with dirt. The realization of what they'd endured began to settle in. And with it, the haunting quiet that follows intense combat. Some stared at the horizon, where the ocean shimmered like glass, wondering how something so calm could border on something so violent. Others busied themselves with rebuilding, cleaning weapons, or digging new trenches. It wasn't just maintenance. It was ritual, a way to keep fear from seeping in. The viewer sees it through the lens of endurance, soldiers who refuse to break even when the world around them has. Then, as the afternoon shadows lengthened, a new sound emerged, low, distant, and rhythmic. Not artillery this time, but engines. The first thought was rescue, but as binoculars focused, what appeared were not friendly craft, but enemy reinforcements approaching the coastline. The Japanese had not accepted defeat. They were coming back. Yet this time, the Marines were ready. Orders rippled through the line, every man to his post, ammunition distributed, fields of fire adjusted. There would be no surprise this time, only resolve. The tension mounts in the narration. The audience feels the heartbeat of the camp, the slow tightening of anticipation before the next storm. The commanding officer raised his binoculars, scanning the horizon one last time before speaking. "They think last night was our limit," he said quietly. "Let's show them how wrong they are." The men nodded, expressions calm, almost grimly eager. The fear that had defined the night before was gone, replaced by focus, that dangerous kind of confidence earned only through surviving the impossible. And as the camera pans across their faces, young, exhausted, determined, the narrator delivers the line that anchors the point. They had been trapped, written off, nearly erased from history. But now they were the trap, and the island itself was on their side. The final image of this segment lingers on the horizon, the faint outline of approaching ships against a blood-orange sky, waves breaking against the reef like the pulse of something ancient. The music swells low and deliberate as the screen fades to black. And just before the cut, a single voice on the radio whispers, "Contact imminent." That's where we leave the audience, suspended between relief and dread, hooked by the promise that what comes next will redefine the meaning of survival and strategy in war. By late morning, the island was quiet enough for the sound of the sea to creep back into awareness, but that calm was deceptive. Beneath it, the Marine command teams were already piecing together the next move. They knew the Japanese would return in force. The only question was when and from where. Instead of waiting for the blow to land, the Marines planned to turn the very map of the island into a weapon. Intelligence officers studied captured notebooks, triangulated radio intercepts, and built a mental picture of enemy supply routes that wound through jungle gullies and across coral flats invisible from the air. Every contour line, every ridge, every bend of coastline became part of the plan. The Americans had learned from the night before that speed and surprise could invert any imbalance of numbers. Now they would apply that same lesson deliberately, not as a reaction, but as strategy. The first step was misdirection. Patrols were sent to the western beaches to create the illusion of weakness. Fake signals, staged movements, even decoy campfires after dark. Meanwhile, engineers and infantrymen worked in near silence to dig, firing positions, and set cross-sector fields of fire along the eastern approach. It was slow, back-breaking labor, but it meant that when the enemy advanced toward what they thought was an opening, they would walk straight into converging arcs of defense. The leadership understood that success would not come from brute strength, but from information, knowing more, seeing farther, thinking faster. In the central ravine, Lieutenant Harper's platoon was assigned to hold what maps called Hill 43, a bare rise overlooking the main trail. The hill itself looked insignificant, little more than a lump of dirt in a sea of green, but from its crest you could see almost the entire valley. Harper's men camouflaged their positions with palm fronds, checked range markers, and waited. Down below, runners carried updates to the command tent, where the colonel stood over a radio operator listening to static that sometimes hid meaning like Foghide's coastline. "We can't control how many come at us," he said, "but we can choose where they die." It was brutal arithmetic, but in war, clarity often sounds that way. When the first enemy scouts reappeared on the horizon that afternoon, the plan was set in motion. Rather than open fire, the Marines let them observe, let them report back exactly what the Americans wanted them to see. Tired men, exposed supplies, loose formations. The deception worked. Within hours, new columns of Japanese infantry began, moving inland, confident they were closing on an exhausted opponent. What they didn't know was that every step they took was being measured, plotted, and anticipated. Spotters hidden in the canopy relayed positions through mirrors and code flashes, adjusting artillery by degrees. Even the ocean joined the ruse. Offshore destroyers cut engines, drifting silently while gun crews stood ready. As dusk fell again, the stage was set. The Marines were outnumbered, yes, but they held the ground as if it had been designed for them. The counterattack would begin not with explosions, but with light, sudden, blinding light. At a signal, flares burst overhead, turning the night into day for a heartbeat, and in that glare the enemy formations froze, exposed and uncertain. Then the island erupted. Machine guns hammered in synchronized bursts, mortars thudded, and the terrain itself seemed to catch fire. But this time it wasn't chaos. It was orchestration. Every shot came from a calculated position. Every explosion drove the enemy closer toward predetermined choke points. The Marines weren't fighting to survive anymore. They were fighting to dominate. From the viewer's perspective, the narration slows here, matching the rhythm of command. We see officers moving calmly through smoke, directing teams with hand signals, checking compasses instead of shouting. The story becomes one of control. How a small force, disciplined and deliberate, can unmake a superior enemy through sheer organization. This section emphasizes planning as its own form of courage, the quiet bravery of those who think, while others panic. It's the contrast between noise and intent, between the apparent chaos of combat and the unseen order beneath it. By midnight, the plan had achieved its purpose. Enemy forces, trapped between overlapping sectors, began to falter. The same hills that had once trapped the Marines now became walls closing in on their pursuers. A lieutenant later wrote in his diary, "We used their map against them." That line becomes a refrain in the narration, a summary of ingenuity born from desperation. When dawn returned, the battlefield looked transformed again. Shattered. Vehicles, smoke, curling from tree lines, but also the unmistakable calm that follows decisive control. And as the camera pans upward, showing the full scope of the battlefield, the narrator's voice ties the lesson together. Victory here wasn't just about strength. It was about imagination, the kind of imagination that sees opportunity where others see entrapment. The music softens, leaving one haunting note as the image fades, leading directly into the next phase of the story, the moment when both sides realize the war on this island has become a contest of minds, not just of men. The night after. The counterattack unfolded like a wound slowly closing. Brutal, exacting, and merciless, where it needed to be. But by the time the first gray light of morning softened the jagged silhouettes of palm and coral, the Marines had done more than repel an assault. They had rewritten the island's map, turning trails into death zones and ridges into sentry points, and the tactical lesson of that night would echo long after the last stretcher left the field. In the dim, we follow a small squad as they clear a bunker line, moving with the fatigue-slowed precision of men who had already burned through fear and were now operating on instinct and training, their boots scuffed through churned earth and spent cartridges, faces hollowed by the long hours. Yet their hands were steady as they tipped grenades into collapsed embrasures and pried open rusted doors that hid the enemy's last, desperate holdouts. What stands out in this hour is not the violence of the acts, which the film treats with respectful restraint, but the choreography. Teams of 4 moving like gears in a well-oiled machine, covering each other, sweeping sectors, calling, coordinates into radios with clipped, efficient language that masks the exhaustion beneath. The camera lingers on tiny human details, a sergeant quietly tying a tape on a radio aerial to mark it for rescue teams, a private offering his canteen to a wounded enemy because medicine, even in war, demands some code of decency. These moments anchor the spectacle, reminding the viewer that strategy is made up of small, humane choices, even in the heart of conflict. As the hours unfold, commanders consolidate gains and count the cost. Intelligence officers comb captured documents, piecing together how the Japanese had conceived the encirclement. Confident geometry, over-reliance on perimeter tactics, and a misjudgment of American resolve. Their mistake had been to assume the trapped force would fight to survive within those lines. Instead, the Marines used the lines as bait, turning the enemy's own expectations into traps. The narrator's tone takes on a reflective quality. Here, pausing to underline the lesson, in warfare, certainty is a liability. Those who assume they know the outcome hand initiative to those willing to exploit the unknown. Analysts in the command tent map the movement of units, marking kill zones and routes of withdrawal, and a theme emerges. The annihilation the enemy feared was not an accident of cruelty, but of careful planning married to brutal will. The tally that morning, taken in hushed voices beneath stained tarps, shows the magnitude of the reversal. Enemy casualties numbering in the thousands, resources seized, and most critically, momentum seized by the defenders. For the higher command. The implications are raw and strategic. Island defenses that had seemed impregnable are now porous. Supply lines have been compromised. The psychological edge has shifted. This is the pivot point of the campaign. Amid the operational reckoning, individual stories give texture to the event. A forward observer named Ramirez becomes our human thread. He is the man who, perched on a low knoll through the longest hours, adjusted mortar fire, watched flares bloom, and radioed corrections that funneled enemy troops into prepared arcs. Later, exhausted and covered in salt and grime, he describes what he saw in a single halting sentence. "We made their map lie to them." His words are simple, but they carry the weight of a doctrine born of necessity: mislead, delay, and then strike with coordinated, disciplined violence. Another vignette follows a medic, Maria, who risked sniper fire to reach a collapsed parapet and pull 3 men to safety. Her actions illustrate another essential truth revealed by the night. Courage is not only the domain of those who fire the first shot, but also those who defy danger to preserve life in its aftermath. These personal threads create empathy, connecting the viewer to the scale through faces and choices rather than statistics alone. The strategic fallout ripples outward. News of the defeat travels fast up the chain and then across the theater. Commanders who had planned future operations based on the assumption of secure enemy positions must now reconsider their timelines. Naval commanders adjust patrol routes to mitigate the risk of reinforcements slipping into islands once considered safely held. The enemy, shaken by the apparent fragility of its cordon tactics, begins to shift resources, diverting troops to rearguard duties, thinning offensive formations elsewhere. Psychologically, an impact that cannot be precisely measured but is unmistakable takes hold. The aura of invincibility that once surrounded those perimeter tactics cracks. In briefing rooms miles from the scene, veterans of earlier Pacific battles lecture junior officers about the danger of arrogance in defensive planning, using the island's night as a textbook case in humility. In a stark, economical montage, we see map pins redistributed, supply manifests rewritten, and radio logs annotated with a new cautionary tone. Yet even as plans are revised and strategies recalibrated, the men who fought the night carry a different burden: memory. They return to makeshift barracks where lantern light picks out faces gaunt with exertion. Some find battered letters in uniform pockets. Others count names with a slow, private grief. The narrator presses here on moral complexity. Victory sometimes arrives in the shape of unbearable loss. The Marines did not seek slaughter. They sought survival, deterrence, an end to encirclement, but whatever their motive, the result reshaped a theater of war and left scars that would be felt in barracks, in messages home, and in the tactical manuals that would later teach other soldiers how to make the enemy's certainty a weapon. This is the part of the story that lingers, the ambiguity between triumph and the weight of what it takes to achieve it. As the sun climbs, the island's attention turns to logistics. Stretcher parties move across rutted paths, supply launches cycle men and materiel ashore, and engineers clear routes for medical evacuation. Cameras record the quiet competence of support units, cooks building hot, if meager, rations, radio operators repairing lines, mechanics coaxing a generator back to life. These less glamorous acts are the true backbone of any sustained triumph. The film's pacing slows, honoring these efforts because without them, the night's tactical brilliance would have been a flash instead of a turning point. In interviews recorded later, officers credit these support roles with turning a desperate stand into a decisive victory. The narration emphasizes the lesson again. War is won by the sum of many small, often unseen labors. By midday, reconnaissance reports confirm that enemy reinforcements, delayed and partially checked by naval interdiction, will arrive in limited numbers and will not be sufficient to regain lost ground. Commanders seize the moment. A modest offensive is planned to push remaining hostile elements into pockets where they can be contained and neutralized without risking another protracted engagement. The operation is conducted with the same discipline that defined the night's success: measured, methodical, and merciless where necessity demands. Small detachments move through choke points, fording shallow streams and using the cover of mangroves to approach remaining enemy clusters. The fighting that follows is described with controlled restraint in the script, focused on maneuver, sound, shouting commands, and the determination of those who must see the job through. The emphasis is tactical prowess, not gore. As dusk closes another day, the island settles into a fragile calm. Command staff assembled to record after-action reports, noting lessons learned and recommendations for future operations. The tone of these documents is clinical: improve perimeter discipline, vary patrol patterns, and never assume numerical superiority guarantees success. In an archival voiceover, historians later describe how this island's night became a case study taught in combined forces schools, a lesson in how initiative and imagination can upend predictable calculations in warfare. The film underscores that point with archival-style overlays, maps annotated with arrows, diagrams of kill zones, and testimonies that corroborate the narrative. Beyond tactical instruction, the story becomes a moral parable about underestimating the human element in battle. Finally, the segment closes on an image that encapsulates the chapter: a weathered flagpole by the shore from which a frayed flag flutters against the evening sky. Around it, men gather in quiet clusters, talking in low voices, sharing cigarettes, and recording names on bits of paper to be sent home. The narrator's voice softens and pulls the viewer in with a lingering hook. Not a promise of triumph or closure, but a question framed as a statement. They had turned an ambush into annihilation, but victory had come at a cost no one could fully name. What would the next dawn demand? The music holds on a single unresolved chord as the screen fades, and the audience is left with the appetite for the next point. How this single night recalibrated strategy across an entire theater and the human price exacted to win it. As the final hours of the battle stretched into dawn, the island lay transformed into a testament of human endurance, discipline, and audacious strategy. The Marines, exhausted yet unbroken, moved with the quiet efficiency of warriors who had survived the impossible, checking perimeters, tending the wounded, and securing captured terrain, while the Japanese forces, once confident in their numerical superiority and tactical certainty, were scattered, disoriented, and forced into retreat. Unable to comprehend how a cornered enemy could turn the tables with such precision, and every ridge, every ravine, every palm grove that had once been a potential trap became a stage where American ingenuity and courage rewrote the rules of engagement, turning the night into a legend that would echo through military history. And as the sun climbed over the horizon, casting long shadows across smoke-streaked fields and shattered bunkers, the sheer scale of the reversal became apparent. Thousands of enemy soldiers neutralized, vital positions secured, and the psychological momentum of the Pacific Campaign irrevocably shifted, while the men who had survived the night, bloodied, soaked, and hollow-eyed, understood that their triumph was not merely a matter of firepower but of will, cohesion, and the ruthless calculation of timing, terrain, and human instinct. And in that knowledge lay both pride and solemnity, for victory had demanded everything of them, every ounce of strength, every fraction of courage, every flicker of focus, and yet they remained standing, guardians of an island that had nearly claimed them. And the story concludes not with the sound of celebration, but with a slow, suspended heartbeat, the camera pulling back to reveal the full scope of the battlefield. A silent testament to the night when 3,200 enemy soldiers were undone, not by luck, but by the unyielding resolve of men who refused to be trapped. And as the final narration threads across the panorama, the viewer is left in awe, contemplating the scale, precision, and audacity of the operation, their heart pounding with the echo of calculated risk and ultimate triumph. Because in that single relentless night, the Marines proved that even when the enemy believes they have victory in their grasp, courage, strategy, and the refusal to surrender can turn the impossible into history, leaving an indelible mark that will resonate far beyond the sands, the reefs, and the palm-fringed ridges of that fateful island. And as the screen fades to black with the faint sound of distant waves and whispering wind, the audience is suspended in awe, carried by the realization that this was more than a battle. It was a transformation of fear into power, desperation into precision, and chaos into the enduring legend of human resolve and mastery over the unthinkable.